Hi, this is Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well, thanking you for checking out this series, this trauma and healing series brought to you by Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative. Hi, I'm Michael P. Coleman, Content Director for Brother Be Well. Today, in one of a series of Brother Be Well conversations on trauma and healing, made possible by the support of Blue Shield of California's Blue Sky Initiative, we're exploring culturally relevant therapy. We'll define it and we'll talk about why it's so important for any individual or organization looking to serve an increasingly diverse population. Let's have a conversation right now. And joining me in this conversation is an integrated behavioral health specialist. He's also a Brother Be Well clinical advisor, and he's also a friend of mine, Julio Cruz. Welcome back to Brother Be Well. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
It's really good to have you. Let's jump right into this great topic, I think, for us to be having on this platform. And I can't think anybody I'd rather have it with, Julio. So let's get at it.
Let's go for it. Thank you for having me again.
First, will you define culturally relevant therapy for the Brother Be Well family?
It's a very broad term, and I think that one of the things that I noticed there is an emphasis right now in cultural relevant therapy, but it's the understanding that we are not uh, all cookie cutter, right? We have to look at the different aspects of who makes us who we are. I think that's something that is very important is to understand that the experiences of one group are not the same as another group and have all those things in mind and keep it into consideration when we are working with a therapist. For me, for instance, it's very important that the therapists that I work with understand what it is like to live in this presentation, right? As a man of color, as a gay man, somebody who has lived in different cultures, and I'm the result of many different cultures, right? That understands that my experiences and the way I see things spiritually, emotionally, are not the same as other people. It's very important to have a lens of what role your culture, your identity plays into your person and how it affects the way you perceive your emotions. And like simple stuff, like if I tell somebody who doesn't have an indigenous background that my spirits talk to me, or like I have a connection with the great spirit or nature, and that the trees talk to me when I approach them, they may think that I'm absolutely crazy and bonkers. But somebody who understands my culture and is not only seeing me in a clinical lens because of what the DSM-5 says, is going to understand me better and is going to have a much better relation with me.
I really appreciate that. That's a beautiful way to put it, Julio. And I knew you do a great job there. A really beautiful way to put that and easy to understand. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
On the surface, one might think that therapy is therapy, and I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit here. You might think that therapy is therapy, and you needn't necessarily be culturally relevant as long as that therapy is effective. For example, if someone is being treated for anxiety or depression, cultural relevance, as you just described it, can take a back seat to the clinician's competence with regard to anxiety or depression, what led you to the therapist to begin with. Can you walk us through why cultural relevance is so very critical when we're working with a diverse set of consumers?
Absolutely. I think that being being a person who experiencing depression or is going through anxiety is a very broad term, right? What does that look like for me? What does it mean? What are the sources of my depression and my anxiety? As when we look at cultural aspects of that, do I come from a culture that values family and community in a much deeper way than other communities? Or is it important for me to be able to have access to nature, to ritual, to cultural practices? Is that what is causing me to feel this depression or feel anxious for being, having social components to my day-to-day life that I'm not used to, or that I'm experiencing intergenerational trauma? Somebody who doesn't have those experiences is not going to understand that therapy, there's the basics of it. That's what you learn in school. That's what you like can read in a book, right? But the reality is that then what what connection you have with the person that is in front of you, whether it's right now with telehealth, even more important to understand that there is an importance for me to have the face-to-face contact, to be in proximity of somebody, feeling that warmth, feeling that confidence. And since it's not possible for a lot of us right now, how do I build that connection where you spend 5 minutes of your time first getting to address me in the as a whole, right? Rather than just jumping into, okay, so our session is starting right now, and let's use some CPT or DBT to cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever modality you want to apply without really addressing the other components of my life.
I really appreciate that one too, Julio. You remind me of when you and I met for the first time here in a digital session, kind of like this one. And when we finally met face to face, I felt like I knew you already. We were already good buddies. So the first time we sat down and had a cup of coffee, I don't know if you remember
Oh,
that or not, but
absolutely, yes.
yeah, we had a connection already. So really appreciate that perspective as well. I've always thought about language being both unifying and dividing. It can be a little bit of both, I think. With regard to the different languages that are often spoken among mental health consumers and by members of the general population, even, there's a critical difference I learned between providing translation services and providing interpreter services. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you can differentiate between those two. Everybody's not aware that they're not completely interchangeable. So why don't you differentiate between the two for the family?
For me, translation is like you're literally saying what the words into a different language, right? But interpreting it goes much deeper. You have to be familiar with somebody's culture to understand what the words mean, what an expression means. And I think that sometimes it's even like if you speak the same language, like, I if I had a therapist who, I don't know, I'm going to my therapy in a Spanish session, but it's somebody who is from Venezuela and doesn't have the context of the way that I interpret language as a Spanish speaker that was both grown in Mexico and Spain, the context of that is going to get lost. So the interpretation is very important to know that you're putting a piece of what the person is meaning and feeling into the words.
What are some of the things that can hinder cultural competence? If that's the goal, I'm wondering what are some of the things that can get in the way or be a barrier to achieving cultural competence?
I think that sometimes when we go and try to learn what cultural competency is, we we think that because we learn about a specific way of addressing a population, that's all it takes, right? And then we what we are doing, we're adding preconceived notions of this person is going to present this way because of their race or their ethnicity or their background. And it's like trying to find that balance in between. This is how me being aware of other people's culture can help me, but also having the humility to know that I'm not an expert on those person's cultures and that I had to remove all my preconceived ideas that just because I took a few classes on cultural competency, I'm going to be ready to work on it. It's a day to day process. And I think the biggest hindrance is to think that I'm ready all the time, that I have no more to learn. Every time I'm with a new person, I have to learn a little bit about who they are and their culture and how they present it. Like within your community, my community, we all see culture in a different manner. right? Within the indigenous populations, there's a very big difference between how we experience culture. I live in California, in Maryland, I mean, like New York. There is a very huge difference of what culture means to all of us, even within this country, even within the same populations.
You just touched on something. You touched on quite a lot there, Julio. So I'm going to try to figure out where I want to go from what you just said. But you used the word humility that we're going to touch on a little bit later, I hope. But I'm wondering, based on what you just said, how, and I think I know the answer to this, but how will we know? How would someone know when they've achieved cultural competence? How will you know when you've gotten there? Or can you get there?
I think that one of the things is understanding that it's a process that never ends. That you have to allow the person to be the expert on who they are. You're a conduit. The job of, like, when I meet with somebody because they're in crisis and I have to help them, I don't have the answers. The reality is that people have the answers to their own things. I'm just a conduit. I'm not to help them get to where they need to get, and having that humility to know that part of the cultural competence is to know that I'm not the person who's gonna cure or solve anything. I'm just there to help.
Would you agree, there's a bit of an aside, would you agree that humility isn't in abundance in today's society at all? That's a big barrier, I think, because most people aren't humble enough to admit when they don't know something. And for instance, I don't think that's one of my own shortcomings. If I don't know, I'm the first to say, I don't know. I'm ready to learn, and I'm wired to learn something every day. But I don't think that humility is in abundance in today's society. Would you agree or
I
disagree?
agree. It's not in abundance, and I think that sometimes it also comes from an aspect of fear of the unknown, or like sometimes we don't know how to approach somebody to say, "Hey, I don't know everything about your culture, what makes you who you are." And it's a difficult dance sometimes to be with somebody that you're willing to learn from, but also understanding that it's not your responsibility to teach you things about their own culture.
Given everything we talked about so far, Julio, and I appreciate your time and attention today, given everything we've talked about, how can a therapist become more culturally competent? What are some of the steps he or she can take to become more culturally competent?
I want to share an experience that I had when I was looking for a therapist the last time when I moved to Sacramento, and I reached to my medical providers. I said, "Do you have a person of color that uh, can see me?" And it was funny because the first thing they said, "Well, we have somebody who speaks Spanish." And I said, "That sounds amazing, but that's not what I asked for. Um, do you have somebody who uh, who represents that, has some shared live experiences with who I am?" And unfortunately, they didn't. But the first interaction that I had with my therapist, I knew that I had to be very open and upfront and say, "Hey, when I was looking for a therapist, I needed somebody who's more aware of my culture, that is aware of like my experiences, and I wanted a person of color. I'm willing to work with you, but I want to know that you feel comfortable having the humility that you don't understand everything about me, that you don't know everything about what my culture, what my different traditions and everything represent." And that was somebody who was willing to do the work and was willing to learn,
Hmm.
right? And it's I think that when you find a therapist, it's a beautiful relation. If you're willing to work together with the therapist, at the end, it's another person that is also having the same challenges, experiences. Well, we're going through these crazy times together, right? But just as I need him to be humble, I also had to be humble myself. And I had to be honest and upfront and say, this is what works and this is not, this doesn't work for me.
I think, Julio, if you don't mind my saying, I've never had the benefit of being on the receiving end of a statement like the one you just told in your story. Most people, that person I'm sure was proud of him or herself. We have someone who speaks Spanish, and I think it takes a great sense of self for someone to say, that's fantastic, that's marvelous, but that's not what I asked you. That is not the question I just asked you. So I could imagine what the person on the other side of that communication, you force them to kind of step up their game a little bit, I would think. So appreciate having people like you in the world who would just, very clearly say what you want.